Well, 2025 off to a high energy, rip roaring start. Had some pretty major setbacks, some kind of apocalyptic stuff going on, but also some high tea stuff. Inauguration is coming up. America is turning 250 in 2026 next year. Generally, I would say 2025 off to a strong start. Aeneas, on the other hand, not so much. So, welcome to the official start of our Young Heretics tour through Virgil's Aeneid. As you will see, unlike the year 2025, the poem begins with a bit of a stumble, not necessarily a poetic stumble, but Aeneas himself does not stride onto stage as the grand and glorious hero we might expect him to be. We're going to talk today about why that is, as well as why Aeneas is the hero of this poem at all. What's he doing here? Why did Virgil pick him? Why did Virgil choose to tell this particular story at this particular time? We are going to launch now on our proper journey through the Aeneid. If you're just joining us, if you're new to Young Heretics, welcome. This is a great time, actually, to get started, get in on the ground level of this tour through the great Roman epic, the Aeneid. This is the classical education you didn't know you were missing. We've had many, many years, generations even, I would say, of looking down on the classics, of taking them out of school curricula, and a lot of us grew up without access to this stuff, which means we don't really know how awesome it can be and how much it can do for us. That's what the show is here to give to you. So if you're new, don't forget to subscribe. We do weekly episodes, usually 2 episodes a week. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube if you're watching there. Give it a 5-star rating, just help spread the word. But most of all, come along for the journey. This is also an optimal time, whether you're new to Young Heretics or not. This is a perfect time to be reading the Aeneid, actually, because we are in this moment in America where, like I said, we've got our 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence coming up. We're going to have some sort of major celebration, year of major celebrations in 2026. And we've also just been through a period of extreme pessimism about the country and specifically about the founding of the country. We had the 1619 Project, which was a huge deal. The New York Times plastered it everywhere they could, all about how this country is founded in slavery and moral evil. And we ourselves have lived through many years now of turmoil, partisan animus, anger, riots in the streets. We had a really rough few years. And yet now we seem to be living through something like a vibe shift, not just with the election, which of course changed the political direction of the country, but I think more importantly, it's what that election represented in the culture, this brighter idea about who America is, who we are, and as American citizens, and what we want our country to look like. And that includes reconsidering our founding, talking afresh about the heroes of our founding, and saying, yes, there is complexity. Yes, we were founded by humans. The American founders were men, human beings. They weren't perfect. In fact, they had flaws and even sins. They were steeped in history like all of us, and so they came carrying the baggage of their past and their culture and their time. All the same, they were great men, and we can tell a story about them that acknowledges all of the complexity while still celebrating the fact that we're here, the idea that this is a good country. And in all of this, in the time of turmoil that we've been through, in the uncertainty about our past and about our founding, in the need, the desire to kind of have a fresh start and tell a new story about the founding as we move forward into this next part of our history, all of this brings us very close to Augustan Rome and the period when Virgil was writing this epic. Rome had lived through something very, very similar to what we have just lived through. In fact, I would say it was even more intense, even more high octane, and even more dramatic because Rome went through an actual, what you would call a regime change. Their form of government transformed. And so consequently, the turmoil, the fighting, the problems leading up to that moment were also much more intense. In fact, they were real civil wars. Thank God we haven't had civil wars. We haven't lived through a civil war. We've lived through some very dangerous kind of street violence and flirtation with the potential of regime change. But mercifully, we came through this particular period in our history still standing. Not today, Satan. We're not falling. The Republic has not fallen. In fact, we still have a Republic. But at the time when Virgil was writing, the Republic had just fallen. Many hundreds of years, Rome was a republic. They had a form of government similar to ours in some ways. In fact, our form of government is modeled on the Roman Republic. The founders were very interested in it. But from about 133 BC onward, the Roman Republic lived through major constitutional crises, major constitutional reforms, and civic bloodshed. It started with these guys, the Gracchi brothers, who were reformers in the wake of Rome's expansion. As Rome got bigger and started conquering more and more people, there were all sorts of problems about property distribution. The elites, the rich, started to hoover up a lot of land, started to import foreign labor and use slave labor, where the working class was supposed to be able to have small property holdings. Some of the same economic problems that we've been going through, they lived through. And the Gracchi were proposing these major reforms, changes, to try to fix that. Their lives ended in civil bloodshed, which was the first time that had happened since the expulsion of the kings. Of course, Rome had lived through many other periods of turmoil before, but this was the first time that they genuinely had people dying in the streets. And it didn't stop there. There followed 100 years of just horror, the kind of stuff that really leads to regime-level failure, and it's not pretty to live through that sort of thing. If we think we've had it rough, if we think we've had a lot of animus and partisan dispute and anger and political ugliness, there was way more of it in this period of Rome's history. You had Marius and Sulla. You had these serious crises that ultimately, of course, lead you to the moment when Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon. And I've done podcasts about these periods in Roman history before, so it's not really necessary for us to go into all of the details of that again, but just to know that that's what's in the recent past when Virgil is writing. That's what's just gone on. And if you think of the 2020 American year that we had with COVID and everything, and then you multiply it by 10x, and you think about how we felt coming out of that, and we were really reeling, we were totally unsure what was going to happen. We just had a very, very ugly and disputed presidential election, and then we had 4 years ahead of us that many people were extremely discontent with the results of that election, and so we weren't sure what was going to happen. If you kind of picture that mood and that atmosphere, you can think about that in the years after the Civil Wars, because Caesar wasn't the end of it. He was really just the kind of culmination, right? We think of Julius Caesar as the start of the Roman Empire, but he actually wasn't the first emperor. It was his adopted son, Augustus, or before that he was known as Octavian. And it's under Augustus' rule that Virgil is writing. But before Augustus could take control, he had to have another civil war. This is the subject of Antony and Cleopatra by Shakespeare, if you've ever seen that play. Antony was the great rival for power after the Caesarian moment, and Antony becomes the great rival for power, and you get this conflict finally that ends in what's called the Battle of Actium. And so by the end of the 30s BC, then you finally have the conclusion, the outcome of all of this uncertainty and fighting and turmoil. And whether it's an outcome you like or whether it's an outcome you hate and despise and you're like Cato and you've already killed yourself rather than live through the transition into empire, whatever you feel about it, it's a definite outcome. And so now, finally, the dust is going to start to settle. And so two things have happened to Rome in this period. One is they've taken control virtually of the known world. And that was happening from before the days of the Gracchi. The territory was expanding. They were getting more and more power. And this totally unprecedented and unexpected rise to prominence in the Mediterranean had put them in this new position of being effectively lords of the world. So in that level, on the world stage, you could say they'd been on the rise, but they had also internally collapsed and transformed. And now Augustus, the first emperor, and everybody else who had any kind of control or elite status in Rome was going to have to look around and say, what the hell just happened? And what are we going to do about it? Who even are we? It was an identity crisis in the wake of a political crisis. And again, it's not like we have just lived through a civil war, but we are facing many of the same questions. Who are we? Is America good? Where are we going? Are we going to change? Is our position on the world stage now going to change? And these are the moments, these moments of uncertainty, when it becomes really, really important to decide what kind of story you're going to tell about your past, your founding. And Americans are not unique in this. We obviously care about our founders a lot. Many of us learned about them in civics class in high school, but that's not an American thing only. In fact, in the ancient world, it was extremely important to be able to point to your origins, your source. Where did you come from? What mythic story can you tell about the heroes in your past? And our version of this is particularly fraught because we have historical founders, people who actually lived. And so we can't just make anything up about them we want. But there were also traditions and very delicate sort of negotiations going on in the ancient world, from Athens and Sparta on wider throughout the Mediterranean. Basically, every major city-state had some hero or heroes that they could point back to. And for democratic Athens, it was Theseus. But then, of course, there were monarchic figures from legend as well. There was Cecrops. There were all of these different heroes, and different eras and periods would emphasize different people, different mythological lineages for their city and their past as a way of talking about the present, as a way of saying, well, we come from this great hero, and therefore we are like this. We have this institution. We have these sorts of people. And now that Augustus is in control, there's a question, well, who are his mythological ancestors? Where does he come from in the past? And what can we say about us under Augustus and who we are at this pivotal moment in history? And that is the world into which Virgil enters. That's where he finds himself. And, these are the questions that, as an artist, as he starts to make his name as a poet, these are the great questions for some poet to deal with in this time. Any poet of true ambition is going to want to engage himself with this sort of issue. And Virgil is perhaps a somewhat unlikely person to emerge as the final guy who ultimately, enters into this dispute and finally gives the decisive artistic flourish to it. We know a little bit about his life and his history because we have a few sort of ancient biographies. The most important one is from this guy Donatus, and his Floruit is in the 350s. And what that means, when you see FL next to somebody's name, that's a Floruit. It means this is when he flourished. So we're kind of not sure about the specific dates of his birth and death, but 350 AD and thereabouts is when he's writing. So quite a bit later than Virgil. And you can tell, he writes a life of Virgil where you can tell that there's a lot of already legend and word of mouth around this guy, because once somebody has risen to the stature that Virgil had risen to, he really became, in some sense, like poet laureate of the new Augustan Rome. And once a guy gets there, then all sorts of urban legends start to spring up around him, and you're going to get a fair amount of fact and fiction and anecdote and a bunch of stuff kind of mingled together. But even that sort of thing is useful and helpful for us, because even the rumors that people tell, even the gossip, even the backstage gossip that people say about Bob Dylan is helpful, not necessarily as everything that definitely happened to Bob Dylan is contained in that gossip, but it tells you what people thought about him and what it was like and what it was like to be there. And so from Donatus' life, we get some details that seem probable. We get some stuff that was clearly added later on in the manuscripts. And then we get some stuff that is obviously just part of the legend that grows up around Virgil as a way of kind of telling his story, and it's like a little bit of like fangirling out that we get with him. But one thing that seems clear is that Virgil comes from fairly humble origins. He's from Mantua, which is in the north of Italy, so up to the north. And Donatus emphasizes that this is kind of a relatively obscure place. His dad was not particularly well known. We're not 100% sure which things, what it was that his dad did, and Donatus gives us a bunch of different possibilities. Maybe Virgil was raised as a potter, maybe he was a magician, maybe he was a beekeeper. Who's to say? The beekeeper one, I think, is probably taken from the poetry itself, because there's a lot of metaphors and imagery about bees and ants and these little industrious workers that we will get into as we start talking about the poem. So you can see already in this how some sort of truth, namely Virgil is an obscure Mantuan from the north of Italy, gets layered on with all sorts of details that are probably from the poetry or just there to increase the drama of the story, because then you're going to get this humble northerner who makes his way to the big city and gets to know Augustus via his stable master. So the guy that is in charge of the emperor's horses and his other animals gets to know Augustus, and Augustus has all of this insight into like the lives, what kind of dog is going to get born on what kind of day and to what sort of parents, and really knows a lot about horses and can predict their character and what to use them for and all this stuff. And this gets him more and more favor. It increases his ration. He gets more and more bread from the emperor ultimately, and he's called finally to an audience in the life with the emperor himself. So Donatus says there was this meeting between Octavian, Augustus, and Virgil, who has not yet written the Aeneid, so he's not yet risen to this giant prominence, but Octavian has an uncertainty about his birth father. He's asking, do I belong to Octavius, the person I was told was my father, or somebody else? Because remember, he was adopted by Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was not his father. And so off the bat, one of the things we can see from this life is that there was this relationship between Virgil's poetic career and Octavius or Augustus's lineage. This where does he come from? What is his origin story? And how can we situate him in the larger sweep of history that goes back to our Roman origins and even before that to the Greek past, right? And in the story, in Donatus, Virgil says, well, you were clearly the son of a baker because you keep giving me bread. And this is very funny to Augustus, and they become kind of buddies, or at least Virgil gets in with the upper circles of the Roman imperial elite. And this is where, we get the idea, at least, that Virgil clearly found favor with the imperial court. And so as he starts to make his name as a poet, there comes more and more of the possibility that actually this is going to be the guy who gives us the story of Rome, who tells us our origins, tells us our ancient history in a way that we can finally endorse and get on board with, and that incorporates this new ruler, Augustus, into the whole story. And this is where I have to issue a correction, because I made a mistake last time, and I hate making mistakes. I try really, really hard not to make mistakes, to give you guys good information all the time and always be correct before I open my mouth. But one of the exciting things about podcasting, one of the fun things, is you talk off the cuff and you're talking in mid-flow, and sometimes you forget things and you say the wrong stuff. So I want to be transparent about that, and I think in 2025 we could all be a little bit more straightforward with one another. So made a mistake, and as I was talking about Aeneas and the history of Aeneas, I said that he was a prince of Troy, which is true. And then I went into kind of autopilot, and I was like, as a prince of Troy, he was the son of Priam, the king of Troy, and a brother of Hector. And some of you wrote in to point this out, so thank you for pointing this out. That is wrong, and that's importantly wrong, because actually Aeneas comes from a different part of the Trojan royal family. He's the son of Anchises and the goddess Venus. And the reason that's important is because once you get Venus into the picture, then you can have this divine origin, not only for Aeneas, but ultimately we're going to trace the descent of Julius Caesar to Aeneas' son Ascanius. And so we have this lineage that is being put in place here as part of what Virgil is doing. And so that becomes important down the line. And I wanted to make that very clear, to issue that correction. Thank you for those of you who wrote in and mentioned this, because that is really important. So this is going to be the poem that Virgil finally etches his name into all posterity for. It's not the only thing he writes, it's not the only thing he cares about, but this is the one where all of Rome is waiting with bated breath to see what he can do. And here's what Donatus writes about it, which I really love. This is in the life of Virgil, and he talks a little bit about the reception of the poem and also how Virgil wrote the poem, which is important because remember that Homer was a singer. He was composing kind of through performance, and it was oral, it was not written down. And so Virgil's main model is this singer. This is the Greek epic poet that he's trying to outdo. But here's what Donatus writes about the Aeneid. He says, the Aeneid was a complex theme of diverse moods, the equivalent, as it were, of both Homeric poems. I mentioned this earlier, that the Aeneid kind of takes the Iliad and the Odyssey, these great Greek epics, and shrinks them down so that each one becomes 6 books long, and it sticks them together, and you have this very dense and compact sort of retelling or revision, transformation, one-upsmanship for the Homeric poems. And it was well acquainted, Donatus goes on, it was well acquainted, moreover, with names and objects Greek as well as Latin, and in this he took the greatest pains. It would encompass the origin of the city of Rome and of Augustus. So this is something he labors over. We hear a little bit about the process. I actually think this sounds kind of plausible in Donatus, but your mileage may vary. He first drafted it in prose and divided it into 12 books, deciding to construct it bit by bit so that he could do each part as it seized his fancy, taking up nothing in order. So you have a really carefully crafted written artifact that goes through multiple drafts. It starts as a prose story. He kind of tells the narrative that he wants to tell, and then he works on different pieces of it, a little bit like a sculptor, carving out different areas of a sculpture. And he's meticulously crafting this thing, which is very, very different from the process I think we have to imagine when we think about Homer. And that's going to become important for Virgil's own presentation and also for the period that we're in. We're in a period now of high culture. And indeed, the period under Augustus is thought of as Rome's literary golden age, where you're already standing at the end of something. There's been this long, long history of Greek poetry that began as kind of wandering itinerant singers. This has its origins in the heroic past, but now we're way, way past that, and we're in civilization, and all of the good things that come out of civilization are part of this poem, but also all of the melancholy that comes from moving on from the past. And so there's very much a sense at the outset here that this is a new poem for a new era, even though it is also trying to gather everything that was good from the previous eras. And that's the first thing, of course, about Aeneas, is that he's fleeing from a falling city and he's grabbing what he can. He takes his household gods, he takes his father, he takes his son. This is the classic image of Aeneas as he sets out from Troy. But we're going to get into all of that. I want to linger a little bit more on the context and what made Virgil write this story, because it's really important and it connects Virgil to us, I think, in a major way. We are also no longer scrappy upstart founders, right? We are not living through the same period as the Pilgrims or the people that went before us. We remember that time with a lot of fondness. We want to keep that spirit, but we have to figure out how to keep that spirit in an age where America is 250 years old, and we've lived through major technological change, and we've gained all of this power on the world stage. So you see how we're in a lot of the same positions that Rome was in, and we're asking a lot of the same questions. How can we be like the founders? How can we admire the founders when we are obviously different from them and we're in a different position? And that's what's going on also with Virgil and Augustus. Now, by the time Virgil wrote this poem, he was pretty clearly already a big deal. There's a famous story, actually, that as the poem was in progress and as its reputation was growing and the expectation of it was growing, that he actually read some of it to Augustus. That is, he got an imperial audience for some of the books of the poem as they were getting ready. So I want to read that portion to you as well, because it tells you about kind of how this poem was received. This grand epic was kind of in the works. Remember that Rome had an epic, the Annales of Aeneas, but it was a very, very different situation. It was much more designed, or crafted rather, for the pre-imperial world, and it was much more about the rough-hewn. It seems to have been, we don't actually have it, but it seems to have been a much more rough-hewn kind of work that comes specifically from the Roman tradition and the Roman kind of farmer world that they look back on as part of their past. Now, Virgil is going to take in also the whole world, including, very importantly, the Greeks, right? And so there's a little passage in Donatus where he says, Julius Montanus was wont to say that there were certain things he would steal from Virgil if he might also have his voice and his mouth and his mimicry. For when Virgil read the lines, they indeed sang out. Without him, they were lifeless and changed. So obviously there's something that Virgil's grappling with about the fact that this is written down and can't be read aloud, or at least can't always be read aloud, even when scarcely begun. The reputation of the Aeneid was such that Sextus Propertius, this is another poet, did not hesitate to prophesy thus: "Give way, Roman authors, give way, Greeks, something greater than the Iliad is born, I know not what." Now, your mileage may vary. There have been big disagreements about this in the past, about whether or not this is true, that this is something greater than the Iliad. But that's the aspiration. That's what people were hoping for, and what Propertius is writing about as this thing is coming into being. And I think, personally, again, your mileage may vary, but I think that the Aeneid has a claim to be the great epic that it wants to be. I don't think anything can ever replace Homer, but I also don't think Homer could have existed in the context of Augustan Rome. And I think that what Virgil did was an amazing literary feat. You may like one or the other more. I personally like the Greek language better than I like the Latin language, so I like reading Homer more than I like reading the Aeneid. But the Aeneid has a number of things, actually, that Homer doesn't have and couldn't have. In the same way that Virgil can't be a singer, and we can't be pilgrims from the days of the New World, also, Homer has things or Homer could never be Virgil. Homer could never be looking back on this history of civilization. And we also, in the modern world, have opportunities that our founders could only have dreamed of. Opportunities like taking the American experiment into space. And, some of this stuff is bad and scary, and it's not great that the world has become so much more complicated, and that there are problems that come with modernity, of course, and decline and decay, and the loss of kind of an old high culture. That's all part of it. But also, there's some stuff that I bet Jefferson and Franklin and Adams would have killed to see. Stuff that seems amazing to be part of this, 250-year-long journey, adventure, and to be thinking now about the possibility of reviving that adventure for a new technological era, like, they would probably be stoked about that. So, one thing that I am always at pains to emphasize on this show, because we do talk about the past a lot, because we talk about the ancient world, is like, as history moves on, things are always lost. Things always fall away. That's just part of our tragic situation, and they can't be recovered. We can't turn the clock back. But things are also gained, and new opportunities are opening up, and that is the part of the melancholy also that Virgil is grappling with and dealing with. So here's this story that he got to read it in front of Augustus. Augustus, for as it happened, he was away on expedition in Cambria, jokingly entreated Virgil in his letters with threats as well as prayers, that you send me your first sketch of the Aeneid or the first colon, it does not matter which. Much later, when he had refined his subject matter, Virgil finally recited 3 whole books for Augustus, the 2nd, 4th, and 6th. And those books have special significance in the poem, especially the 6th book has had a major afterlife in literary history. So that's what this poem is, a work of enormous civic as well as artistic importance. And as we are looking ahead to 2026, we, I suppose, are going to be thinking about what kind of art can possibly meet this moment. That's what Virgil was thinking about. What can we compose under this enormous political pressure as well as artistic pressure, right? You've got the huge anxiety of influence of Homer. You've got the huge anxiety of performing for Augustus and making something that's going to pass muster with him, as well as your place in history, Rome's place in history. What will the world, what will mankind remember about the Roman Empire? So that's what Virgil is doing, and those are all the different kinds of pressure that he is under. And given that he had an almost impossible task in reviving Homeric greatness for an Augustan age, I actually think there are some elements of this poem that are truly amazing and one of a kind. It might not be your favorite poem, as I have said before, it's not my favorite epic in the world, but it is nevertheless unique, and we would be terribly bereft and deprived if it were to be lost. So, why Aeneas? Why is Aeneas the guy who is going to step into this space that Virgil is opening up for, founders wanted, essentially? Who is going to be our ancestral hero? He looks around, thinks about all the different possibilities, thinks about Romulus and Remus, thinks about some of the early kings, thinks maybe about the Republican past, doesn't pick any of those guys. Instead, goes back into the mists of time and begins where the Iliad ends, which is already a smart move, because now you're connecting yourself not just to the past of Rome, but also to the Greek past and to the larger mythic past. You're saying we are the inheritors of all of that, everything that kind of comes out of the Homeric world. And there are some interesting things. You might not have seen this before Virgil elevated Aeneas to this position, but there are some interesting things that make Aeneas an actually really interesting candidate for the guy who is going to kind of give Rome somebody to look up to, somebody to admire and emulate. And the first thing is that he was fated to carry on the greatness of the Trojan line. And this is where we really first encounter him in ancient literature, is in the Iliad. Remember that he's up against Achilles in the Iliad. There are all these Trojan heroes that are fighting the Greeks, and Achilles, in book 20 of the Iliad, he's really like at the point of chimping out over Patroclus' death. He's berserking through the world and ready to just like kill everything in sight. And Achilles, this relatively minor prince, importantly, as I said, not part of the prime royal family, not a son of Priam, the main king, Achilles decides to go up against him. And this puts the chill of fear in the gods themselves, importantly, especially Poseidon, because it ain't supposed to happen. This is not how Achilles is supposed to die. This actually isn't his fight, which actually is something that Virgil is going to make interesting use of down the line. But I want to read to you the passage from the Iliad where we get Achilles, the prophecy about Achilles, because this is what is going to ground Virgil's choice of Aeneas in the best ancient tradition. We have in Homer this prediction from Poseidon that Aeneas is going to live on and needs to live on. He can't die in Troy because he has great things to do after. He has other assignments. So here's what Poseidon says, and as always, I'm translating the Greek myself here for you so that we can get something kind of new and fresh to hear the words again. So we're in book 20 of the Iliad. Here's Poseidon speaking. He says, "Oh, what a sorrow is in me, ye gods, for great-hearted Aeneas. Down he will dart into Hades, defeated by Peleus' son." So he's saying if he goes up against Achilles right now, he's going to die. Defeated by Peleus' son, beguiled by speeches he heard from Apollo, who shoots from afar. So Apollo has been trying to pump Achilles up to his doom to go up against Achilles. Apollo who shoots from afar, that fool of a boy, as if Apollo would protect him when grim doom comes. And why? Why now should this man suffer pointless horror and pain for no reason, for other men's anguish? This man who has been a delight his whole life, with his gifts for us gods who possess the enormous sky. Come on, let's all of us lead death away from him now ourselves. And this is an important element that is going to be major in Virgil, that Aeneas has friends in heaven. He has enemies in heaven, big time, but he also has friends because he is pious, is the Latin word. He is pious Aeneas. which is a much, much bigger word than our word pious. It's where our word pious comes from. But in Latin, to be pious is to observe your duty not only to the gods, but to really everybody. Because if you have the right relationship to the heavenly powers, you will have the right relationship of duty and honor to your ancestors, to your family, to your people. All of that is part of Aeneas' piety, and that's what Poseidon cites here. He says, come on, let's all of us lead death away from him now ourselves, or else we'll be faced with the wrath of the Titan's heir. That is, Zeus has a personal interest, a personal stake in this guy. If Achilles should slaughter this man, what's destined for him is to make an escape and to keep the whole bloodline from death and oblivion, preserving the seed of Dardanus, loved by the Titan's heir above all other children, carried and born for him from the daughters of mortal men. These days, the heir of the Titans is dead set against Priam's line. So Zeus has gotten fed up with Priam and with that branch of the royal family, but he's not fed up with the Trojans overall, the Dardanians they're called. We actually need somebody to carry on this lineage. From now on, the might of Aeneas will rule among Trojan sons, and the sons of his sons, every one of them yet to be born. So we don't, in the Iliad, yet have Rome. We couldn't possibly have Rome, because who would have heard of Rome at this time? But we do have this idea that Aeneas is the one appointed to carry on the Trojan line. Hera basically says, go ahead. We don't really want to get involved, but Poseidon, go ahead and save Aeneas. And so the gods, or Poseidon specifically, saves Aeneas. And what's so amazing about this is we know Virgil was thinking about this because the very first thing that happens in book 1 of the Aeneid almost is that Neptune, that is Poseidon, the god of the sea, saves Aeneas. So Neptune's got a particular interest in him, perhaps, but the guy that's really in charge here is Zeus, who has decided that Aeneas is going to carry on the Trojan line. But why should we care? Why should Rome care? Why should anybody care? Well, there is another connection that is going to become really important here. Besides the Venus connection and the connection to Augustus' royal line, we eventually, as time goes on, we get this idea that Aeneas goes on to found Rome. That is, he will travel to Italy and found the city that will ultimately develop into Rome. Why might the Romans have been interested in this? Why might the Greeks have been interested in this? Well, the key is that the Trojans might actually have been Greek. Dardanus, the founder, is said to have come from Arcadia, that is, from a region of Greece in the Peloponnese, the part where Sparta is, the kind of jutting out peninsula that sticks out from mainland Greece. And therefore, Aeneas is not just Roman, that is, he ultimately ends up founding Rome. He's not just Trojan, he's also Greek. He's everything. He's every possibility. Now, Aeneas kind of complicates this, or rather Virgil kind of complicates this in the Aeneid when he suggests that actually Dardanus was Italian. So he's basically laying claim to the Italianness of Aeneas, but all of this would have mattered, would have made Aeneas a kind of appealing multi-hero. He has all these different dimensions that gather up into one person, a bunch of different stuff that becomes important. So in the same way as he carries all of the wreckage of the past with him, he also becomes the embodiment of the Greek past, the Trojan past, the mythic past, and the Roman or the Italian past. A lot of this we get from Dionysius of Halicarnassus from the 1st century BC. He has a history called the Roman Antiquities. And so we know that this tradition is well established by the time of the Aeneid, that there were all these different stories about how Aeneas had come, but ultimately that he has this connection both to Rome and to Greece. And so in Dionysius, we sort of get the modern, up-to-date, as it were, Aeneas, who finally has been saddled with all of these different traditions and all of these different histories that he has to carry forth. This enormous burden that kind of makes Aeneas a little bit like Virgil. Virgil has to figure out how to get this huge armload of culture, right? All of this ancient material, all of these disputes over the past, all of this rancor and anger. Again, if you think about it in the modern day, it's as if somebody were told, like, okay, take into account the American history of slavery, deal with the triumph of the Pilgrims, like talk to an audience of 2025 Americans, including Democrats and Republicans, and say why Donald Trump is the right person for this moment. Oh, and do it in an epic poem. Like, that's kind of the task that Virgil has here, is to bundle all of that up. And Aeneas also, in a different way, has some of that task. He's got the weight of all these different responsibilities coming with him. And it's into that context that he enters, and we are introduced to him in book one of this poem, and he's a total wuss. Virgil pulls a really, really interesting move here, and he introduces us to Aeneas at his lowest possible point, when he does not in any way seem to feel up to the task. And now I'm going to start reading to you some passages from book one. We're going to crack open the book. Again, if you're just joining us, I recommend the Ellen Mandelbaum translation. What I'll be reading here is my translations of the Latin, but the Ellen Mandelbaum translation is really good. I did a whole other episode on various different possible translations, reviewing them, came down on the Mandelbaum. Even though I love Fagles, who did write a translation, Robert Fagles wrote my favorite Odyssey translations, but I said in that episode that his style, which is kind of a little bit more loose and rambling, doesn't work as well for the Aeneid, which is really, really tightly constructed. It's compact. It takes all of this different stuff and kind of boils it down into one thing. And that's, again, part of this tradition. That's part of the point, is that he's taking the best that he can. He's grabbing what he can. And in some ways, this kind of relates Virgil to T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland when he says, "These fragments I have shored against my ruin," except that instead of shoring up these fragments against my ruin, what Virgil is trying to do is take all these fragments and stitch them back into a new building, a new edifice, a new collage. And so this is why, I am open to critiques of the Aeneid. I get that people feel like it's derivative, but I don't think, you can't tell me this isn't a work of genius. I mean, this is a monumental artistic achievement, even if you prefer the glory days of Homer and you think nothing can rival Homer and whatever. I don't think you can really spit on the Aeneid the way some people like to do. I think you have to honor and respect this poem and take it seriously, even if you have problems with it. So let's begin at the beginning. We introduce our subject in a classic epic fashion by saying, here's what I'm talking about. This is how Homer begins his poems. The Iliad starts with Main in Aeide Thea, goddess, sing the rage of Achilles. The Odyssey starts with Andramoi ennepe musas, tell me about this man, Muse, and he's polutropos, that is, he is a man of many ways and wanderings. And in my series on the Iliad and the Odyssey, I talked a lot about how important those opening words are and how they set the trajectory and the plot of the whole poem, once you announce that, once you say, I'm going to talk about the rage of Achilles, or I'm going to talk about the man who has many ways and wanderings, that's what your audience is going to be tracking, and that's what you have to resolve by the end. That's how you can kind of understand the structure of these poems and view them as complete wholes, even though all sorts of things happen. We're always working out this opening theme. So what's Virgil going to tell us about? Well, he's going to tell us about arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus aboris, Italiam fatu profugus Slaviniaque venit. So, arma virumque cano. Arma is a Latin plural word meaning arms, that is, weapons, and a vir, a man, is the second word. So I'm singing about arms and a man. I sing of arms and a man is the classic way to translate this. And the I sing part is important too, because he's not starting by invoking the muse, right? Remember, Homer asks the goddess, the muse, the goddess of art, to breathe into him this story, to sing to him so that he can sing to us. Virgil is going to invoke the muse later on, but he starts by saying, it's me. I'm the one who's singing. Now, there's a couple reasons why he might have done this. One is to say, I'm not Homer, and I'm not just ripping off Homer. I'm actually my own person, even though I'm talking about the same stuff Homer is talking about. Because the other major feature of this opening is that it tells you I'm going to talk about both the Iliad subject and the Odyssey subject. I'm going to combine them in one, because vir, man, is a sort of translation of aner in Greek, also man. That's how the Odyssey starts with a man, and the Iliad starts with arma, with manus or battle fury. So the arma is the Iliad, the virumque is the Odyssey, and the cano is Virgil. And so in these three words in the opening line, we get this new poet singing about two old things. We get both the Iliad and the Odyssey and Virgil all bound up, and then later on we're going to say, and there's also a register for the gods to be involved here. So in Virgil, sort of unlike in Homer, there's a very distinct double register. There are two realms where Virgil will sing to you, but also the gods can sing, and there's kind of a question of who is singing when, and which parts of this are divinely ordained, and which parts are human and flawed, and all of that is going to build in as we go down the line into the ambiguity of, is this ultimately a pro or anti-Augustus poem? Because even though everybody loved it in the time, and even though it seemed to satisfy all the demands of the period to kind of celebrate the new imperial Rome, there have also been modern scholars who've said, actually, I think Virgil is doing something a little trixier here, and he's also allowing us to be pessimistic about the future. So there's sorrow about the loss of the past, there's pessimism, but there's also all of this glory for the future. We are going to talk all about how to unpick these various things, but let me just read to you my translation of the opening few lines, right? Warfare and a man. I sing of the first from the shores of Troy, chased out by fate to Italy and Lavinium, where at last he came ashore. So many things on land and on the deep, under almighty hands, by savage Juno's unforgetting rage, he suffered. In war as well, so many things to found a city and bring his gods to Latium, from which the Latin race and Alban fathers and the walls of Rome leapt up. So we know what we're talking about. We're talking about the journey that is eventually going to lead to the founding of what will become Rome. It's going to involve some parts of the Iliad, that it's going to involve war, but it's also going to involve journeying and identity, like in the Odyssey. And just like in the Odyssey, there are going to be many, many stages to this journey. In the Odyssey, we have repetitions of the word polla or polloi, which means many in Greek. And here we have multa. He suffered many things he had to do in order to found this city. And that's where we're kind of jumping off. And the next thing we learn is that he has a big enemy in heaven. So we've got our hero, now we've got our antagonist, and it's Juno, which is the Roman Latin word for Hera, the wife of Zeus. She hates him. Why? Well, she loves Carthage, which is another major thread here. We're going to talk about that in a future episode, but Carthage was Rome's prime rival up to this point. And this is going to change now going forward, but one of the things that Virgil has to do is put Carthage to bed. Carthage is a North African maritime empire who has been the rival of Rome for power in the Mediterranean. Juno loves Carthage, and she has learned a prophecy that Rome is going to defeat Carthage, which by Virgil's day has basically happened, kind of decisively. And so Juno is trying to stop that from happening. She can't, because Zeus has decided, as in the Iliad, that there's going to be a great line race that comes out of Troy and ends up being Rome. But that's not going to stop Juno from doing everything she possibly can to resist fate, to push back the fate of Carthage and the future of Rome. And so the first thing she does is she goes to Aeolus, character from the Odyssey, signaling that this is the Odyssey part of the poem, and gets Aeolus to release all the winds, to create a big storm and make things very, very unpleasant for Aeneas. And this, after all of that has happened, after Juno has announced her rage, after she has decided she's going to try as hard as she can to maintain her dignity and destroy this enemy that she has, finally, line 92 of the poem is where we first hear Aeneas' name. So this is take that, Homer, because Homer had this interesting technique in the Odyssey where he made us wait for a while to hear Odysseus' name. We had Andra moi enepemusa polutropon, that is, sing me this man, this complicated, twisty man, to use the very much maligned or much discussed Emily Wilson translation, but this man of many twists and turns, ways and wanderings, and not until 21 lines into the poem do we hear the name Odysseus. But Aeneas here is doing the same thing, only he's waiting 92 lines, so he gives us way more. He's demonstrating even more control than Homer, or at least that would be perhaps the way he would sell it, right? I'm even outdoing the great master Homer. Finally, at long last, much awaited, here comes Aeneas onto the scene in the middle of the storm. What does he do? He cries and wishes he was dead. This is why I say we meet Aeneas at his lowest point, in some sense. We meet him when he feels totally at a loss to satisfy the role in which fate has placed him. All of this weight, all of this anxiety, all of these things that he's supposed to do, all of these things Virgil is supposed to do with him, everything we've been expecting, waiting for up until this moment. Aeneas is like, I don't want any of it. It's awful. Please let me out of this. And here's what he says. Famous speech where he prays, he wishes he had died in Troy. That instant, all Aeneas' limbs go limp with cold. We enter into the present tense, which is something that Virgil is famous for doing, and very immediate, right? Present tense description. That instant, all Aeneas' limbs go limp with cold. He moans and gropes toward the stars with both his hands and cries aloud as follows. 3 and 4 times blessed were those who died in Troy beneath her towering walls, before their father's eyes. Strongest of all Danaans, Diomedes, couldn't I have fallen on the plains of Ilium? So the Danaans are the Greeks, the Dardanians are the Trojans, but the Danaans are the Greeks. Diomedes was a great hero of the Iliad. Couldn't I have fallen on the plains of Ilium? Couldn't your right hand have spilled my soul upon the ground where Hector lies, ferocious, run through by Achilles' spear and massive Sarpedon, and where the currents of the Simois snatch shields and helmets and the mighty bodies of so many men and churn them underwater? The Simois is the river that has all these corpses, glutted with corpses, and he says, why couldn't I be one of those corpses? And that's the picture that we get of Aeneas before he is saved by who else? Neptune. Neptune, who in the Iliad had saved him from being killed by Achilles, now gets annoyed that the winds are destroying or messing up the sea without his approval. Because, of course, Neptune, Poseidon, he's the statesman of the sea. And he's portrayed here as a Roman statesman who calms the seas. There's a simile that, this is like somebody who can go among the troops or among the rabble and give a great political speech. So already we have some sense that like the world of modern Rome is here in the world of the poem, but it's being played out on this grand stage. It's kind of contained in this Iliadic Odyssean journey. And now we really are kind of deep in the Odyssey, actually, because the Iliad part is the second 6 books. The books 7 through 12 of the Aeneid is based on the Iliad, but this part is based on the Odyssey, books 1 through 6. Neptune sweeps in again and saves Aeneas, and now everything is going to be okay. Don't worry, darling. Aeneas and his son Ascanius are going to survive, and Zeus himself assures Venus, mother of Aeneas, that everything is going to be okay. It has to be okay because Ascanius, whose surname was Ilus, is now Iulus. And of course, that sounds like Julius. And so Julius Caesar is going to come from this line. So off the bat, we get the certainty, the assurance that Augustan Rome is going to emerge out of what looks like a pretty hopeless situation. But all the same, massive forces of history are at work. The gods are at work. The end is ordained. The question that the poem presents us with at the opening is, how is this pitiful little guy who wishes he was dead, how is he going to grow to fill that role? And you might say, how are these Romans who have just had this 100 years of civil war, who have totally collapsed, whose project in some sense failed, whose state has now transformed into an empire, how are they going to rise to fill the role of masters of the world that history has placed them in? You might also say, how are we Americans who can't seem to agree about anything, who are constantly fighting, who have just had years of riots in the streets, how are we going to fill the role of America in 2025 and going forward? These are the questions that Aeneas is dealing with. They're very similar to the questions we're dealing with, and that's where the whole thing starts. In some ways, this is the first great reflection in world literature on the great man theory of history, because there's this huge kind of historical sweep going on. There's this realm of the gods that Virgil sets up by invoking the muse sort of later on in the poem, but he's also set up the realm of man by starting out with his own voice, right? Kano, I sing. He starts out with this realm of the human, and he says, even though the gods are at work, we also have these human beings that are kind of struggling to make their way through, trying to figure out how it's going to work. And basically what we have is Frodo saying to Gandalf, I wish this need not have happened in my time. That is, if it has to happen, if history, dooms Troy to fall, if history means that there has to be some continuation of the Dardanian line, I wish it weren't me. I wish I could have died. And of course, the answer, which comes from Gandalf, is, so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides the will of evil. And that's what's going on. There are other forces at work besides Juno. There's Neptune, there's Zeus, there's Venus, there's all of these gods that have ordained this future for Aeneas. And then there's little Aeneas, like little Frodo, asking, how the hell am I ever going to make it through this journey? So that's where the poem opens. Once you understand everything that's going on, the backdrop and all the stuff that we've talked about, it's an awesome opening to the epic, because it is both epic in the sense of having this massive storm scene and gods and demigods and winds and all that stuff, and also intensely human in the person of Aeneas. So sometimes people get down on this, like, oh, Aeneas is just a little wimp. Oh, he's like such a sad sack. He's flopping around. He's wishing he was dead. But that's the whole point. That's what Virgil is doing. He's saying, yeah, of course there's epic. Of course there is a grand sweep of history going on. But how are we, human beings, supposed to fit into it? So many things have been lost. What is there to save from fallen Troy, from the fallen Roman Republic, from the fallen past? One of my absolute favorite things about the Aeneid, and something that was really important for us as we think about how to celebrate America's 250th birthday, is that the Aeneid shows very clearly that patriotic literature that is triumphant about history, doesn't have to be simplistic or jingoistic or stupid. It's often said that patriotic literature is sort of dumb literature, and that's the sense of scorn that we get from things like the 1619 Project. Those smart people are the deconstructionists. They're the ones who are sarcastic and critical of the past. But to glorify the past is just to be a kind of brain-dead jingoist. Now, this is obviously untrue if you think about it for 5 seconds. It's a very powerful cultural assumption that we have now. The Aeneid is a great example of how that does not have to be true. You can write a very complicated, very thorny work of literature that acknowledges all of the problems of the past and the present, while also, I think, ultimately saying it's good that we're here. Now, there's a whole debate about this. It's a modern debate over whether Virgil actually wants us to think that Rome is good. And it's only a modern debate. We have no record of the ancient readers of this poem debating over this. It seemed to be a frankly pro-Augustus poem in the ancient world. But in the modern world, as all this deconstruction got going and people started to be skeptical of empire and power and, fascism happened and whatever, everybody started to be like, is Virgil actually a secret subversive? And we'll get into all of this debate. I'll talk to you about some of the major players in it down the line, but just to show my hand at the outset, because I always want you to know that you're getting my take here. The whole debate is really stupid because it's too simplistic. It imagines that, this is either a pro or an anti-Augustus poem, but that's the simplicity and stupidity of the modern deconstruction point of view, that, we have to take a side here. Actually, I think what Virgil is doing, and the reason he's a great artist, is he's celebrating without romanticizing. So he's able to see what a great work it was for Rome to be founded. He's able to see what a great thing it is for Rome to be in power, and what a magnificent, enormous, historic thing it is, while also seeing that there's tragedy and sorrow and loss involved in the transitions of history, and that the past is the past and we can't get it back, and now there's something new happening, and that is sad and sorrowful as well as big and grand and exciting. And I think that is something for us to remember, even if we are patriotic, even if we love America. We don't want to fall into the trap of feeling like we can't admit anything negative. We can't say any flaws. We can never say that there was anything bad that happened in the past of America, like everything was totally fine. It wasn't. We have to find some way of acknowledging that there are problems, that slavery was a great moral evil, all that stuff, while also saying it's good, grand, and even great that we are here. So, great time to be reading the Aeneid. Glad you're here with me. Like I say, one more time, just subscribe to the show so that you can get our regular episodes. We're just going to move through the story of this poem as we go. Today was a lot of background, plus cracking open the first few verses, the opening of book one. And, we're going to take our time because that's one of the luxuries of a podcast. We can just talk more and more about it. If there's anything I say you want to hear more about, anything that's particularly interesting to you, you just drop me a line, let me know. Easiest way to get in touch with me is rejoiceevermore.substack.com. That's where you can DM me or email me if you like, and you'll also get my weekly writing and some other fun stuff. Plus, you can support me if you like. If you want to become a paid subscriber, I'd be really grateful, and there's extra goodies, and that's a way to help keep this work going. And it helps keep the number of ads on this show down, which is also nice. I like doing ads when I believe in the sponsor, and I've got some great sponsors that I love for this show, but I don't want to be just reading an ad every 5 seconds. And the easiest way for you to help me with that is to support me by becoming a paid subscriber at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Plus, it's fun. You'll like it, I promise. Anyway, here's the other thing you can do when you're a Substack subscriber is you can be in the mailbag. I've been skipping the mailbag recently because I've had lots to talk about, and it's a new year and we're kind of getting things started, but I'm getting back into it now. I've got a lot of questions backed up, but I would love to know questions you have about epic poetry, about this stuff we're talking about, or anything else if you're interested. So here's Jason. Jason says, I was listening to your review of The Return. This was the Odyssey movie that came out recently. I didn't like it very much. I started thinking about other versions of the Odyssey. One that I always liked was O Brother, Where Art Thou? Now, it is loosely based on the Odyssey, and it brings up my question. What is your take on versions of the classics that have been updated to a more modern time? Another example of this is West Side Story, which is a modern version of Romeo and Juliet. And what makes some of these adaptations work versus other ones that are total garbage? This is a really, really good question. I have a few questions about my review of The Return that I want to get to because I thought it was an interesting discussion that got kicked up after I kind of, didn't really like the movie very much. There's a bunch of these, the kind of thing that Jason is talking about, where it's not quite an adaptation of the original thing in the way that, say, The Return technically was, or it looks like Christopher Nolan's movie is going to be set in ancient Greece and actually a movie adaptation of the poem. But the other thing you can do is you can set it somewhere else. You can transpose it. I would think of these more as transpositions than adaptations. I'm thinking of like Apocalypse Now, which is based on Conrad's Heart of Darkness. There's also Ulysses by James Joyce, one that's so famous we sometimes don't even think about it, but this is Joyce's great modernist novel. I think it's the greatest thing James Joyce ever wrote. I actually think it's awesome. Maybe we'll do some episodes on it down the line. But that's a major example of a total reworking. I mean, it takes place in Dublin, right, in the modern world, and it's Bloom, it's not Odysseus, it's a whole different kind of world, but it still follows the structure in some ways. You might even, if you were being like very cheeky, you might say that the Aeneid is actually kind of like this, because it takes the structure and the patterns of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it repurposes them or transposes them into a new setting. There's a novel from 1965 called The Warriors, which got made into a movie later on in 1979, which is based on the Anabasis, work by Xenophon. And so these all kind of, some of them are obscure, some of them are well known. But Jason's asking, like, what makes it work? How can you do this well? And it's a good question because, this is something I feel like we could be doing more. We're in this era where everybody's adapting things, comic books and superhero stories and whatever. Like, we could be adapting the ancient stories a lot more. If what we're looking for is like great IP to kind of dig into. And there are all sorts of ways that you can use an ancient story as inspiration for a modern story. You can carry it on. You can tell like backstory or embroidery around it. And this was very popular in the ancient world, not so much to retell the story as to tell like what we would now call fanfic. Somebody said that by starting off the year with the Aeneid, I'm starting off the year with fanfic, and there's some truth to that, right? This is like what happened after, right? What was the backstory, and what's the, where did Han Solo come from? And that's what Virgil's doing. A lot of the Greek tragedians did this. They would tell like alternate versions of the story or whatever. Then you can do that transposition thing I was talking about, where you take it to a different time or place, like West Side Story is a good example. Ulysses, one of my favorite modern poems is called Omeros by Derek Walcott, and that is basically a transposition, takes it into, I guess it's into the Caribbean that poem does that. And I'll drop a link to that in the description of the show because it's a really interesting poem. And then you can like comment on it or kind of fold it into the plot in some way. So there's Kiss Me Kate by Cole Porter's musical Kiss Me Kate, which takes a production of The Taming of the Shrew and folds it into a modern story. There's a lot of that with Shakespeare. You get like stories about making Shakespeare. Even like Hail Caesar, which is a kind of underrated movie that I really love, is about a movie that is about the gospel. So it's like it takes the gospel, but it also folds it into a modern story. And I think all of these can work, and all of these are ways to like do adaptations and transpositions right. The key, I think, and this is going to sound so simple, but I actually think this is really the key, you have to like the original. You have to think that it was good and worthwhile in some way, even if you're going to change elements of it. There is, the tragedians would often change the story of Homer, or, change the Iliad, change the Odyssey in some way. They'd tell some alternate version, but they did that because they knew that there was so much of substance, so much worth in Homer, that you could try it out a different way, and that would be good too. I mean, it's said that Aeschylus said all of his plays were just slices from the banquet of Homer. And I think love, actually loving the original, is a key to doing any kind of interpretation. And that is what makes so many modern adaptations kind of suck for me, is that I feel as if they're done in a spirit of critique or disdain. And if that's how you feel, why take off on the story at all? It's kind of like a lot of these, quote unquote woke adaptations of like superhero movies and stuff, or fantasy novels. Like if you think that the original is so racist that you have to like fill it with all these other different race characters, or if you think the original is so sexist that you have to like turn this male character into a female character, why are you adapting it at all? And the answer is because it's good. People love it, and you want to take people's love for it and use it for your own stupid project, which is actually against the spirit of the original. And that's kind of like what happens, especially in a lot of these ones where the villain turns out to be the good guy. I know that I'm sort of a fan of Wicked, but Wicked does do this. There's a Grendel movie coming out about the villain of Beowulf, where it's like, I think probably Grendel is going to have a sympathetic backstory. There were orcs in Rings of Power that were like this. And this is an old thing. In fact, the Gnostic Gospels are kind of like this to some extent. Gnosticism is about, in big ways, Gnosticism is about how the God of the Bible is actually the villain. And it's like the oldest hot take in the book, and they're still always doing this. Like His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman is this. There have been cartoons that are sort of like this recently. And it's like, okay, well, if that's what you think, then you actually don't think the story is any good. You think the opposite of the story is good. And you're trying to like unmake the basic ethical assumptions behind the story. And if that's what's happening, then all you're doing is using the story for clout. You're trying to borrow its power and its meaning to people. And so when I'm watching an adaptation, I'm always watching for that. It's not like you can't change things. It's not like you can't even radically revise the story or try it out a different way. It's just that you have to do that in a spirit that suggests you actually love the original source material. So for me, that's the question. The only question, really, because artists do all kinds of playful stuff, but did you like the original? And I get the feeling from Virgil that Virgil loves, honors, respects Homer, even though he's trying to outdo him, even though he's a like friendly competition between Virgil and Homer. This is like, I'm a great poet, but you are, greater than I could ever be because you come before me. So how can, he who comes before me is greater, or he who comes after me is greater, for he was before me, right? There's like a spirit of that in the Aeneid that I think also animates really great adaptations as well. All right, that's, I think, a good start to our journey through the Aeneid. If you want to be in the mailbag, as always, write into me at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Now is a great time to subscribe, to join, to share. All of that stuff is awesome. And of course, please do check out my book. This is called Light of the Mind, Light of the World. Illuminating Science Through Faith. Been getting some great reviews recently, like not just on Amazon, but the wonderful little review in The Catholic Thing. On Commentary, there's a beautiful review of this book, and I really, I'm proud of this, and I think you will enjoy it very much. If you do like it, go ahead and drop 5 stars on Amazon too. That really helps me. That's it for me this week. As always, I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.